speak at a bunch of things right now. We have Light from the Ancient East by Adolf Deissmann, Christianity Through the Centuries by Carnes, and we have God's Secretaries, The Making of the King James Bible by Adam Nicholson, and we have The Harvest of Hellenism by E.F. Peters. So I want you to bear in mind right here that Paul warns us that the Jews always desired a sign, and that the cross was foolishness to the Greeks because the cross was just telling someone that they have to be persecuted and die, and that it's not about making a whole bunch of money and having high position. Just sounds foolishness to people. So in the Light from the Ancient East here, he's explaining to you that Christianity began with poor people, not rich, educated people, but poor people. Like right here it says, in the literary memorials that have come down to us, what we have is practically the evidence of the upper, cultivated classes about themselves. The lower classes are seldom allowed to speak, and where they do come to the front, in the comedies, for instance, they stand before us for the most part in the light thrown upon them from above. The old Jewish tradition coming down to us by a literary channel has, it is true, preserved along with its superabundance of learned dogma much that belongs to the people. The rabbinic texts are a mine of information to the folklores. Yet it may be said of the accessible fragment of the Graeco-Roman literature of the imperial age that it is on the whole, since the vulgar literature of those days is as good as lost to us, the reflection of the dominant classes possessed of power and culture. And these upper classes have been almost always taken as identical with the whole ancient world of the imperial age, compared with primitive Christianity advancing like the undercurrent of a lava stream with irresistible force from its source in the east. This upper stratum appears cold, exhausted, lifeless. Senility, the feature common to upper classes everywhere, was held to be characteristic of the whole age, which witnessed the new departure in religion, and thus we have the origin of the gloomy picture that people are still fond of drawing as soon as they attempt to sketch for us the background of Christianity in its early days. This fatal generalization involves, of course, a great mistake. The upper classes have been simply confused with the whole body of society, or to employ another expression, primitive Christianity has been compared with an incommensurable quantity. But its social structure, primitive Christianity, points unequivocally to the lower and middle classes. Its connections with the upper classes are very scanty at the outset. Jesus of Nazareth was a carpenter, Paul of Tarsus a tent maker, and the tent maker's words about the origin of his churches in the lower classes of the great towns form one of the most important testimonies, historically speaking, one of the most important, the primitive Christianity gives of itself. Primitive Christianity is another instance of the truth taught us with each return of springtime, that the sap rises upward from below. Primitive Christianity stood in natural opposition to the high culture of the ancient world, not so much because it was Christianity, but because it was a movement of the lower classes. The only comparison plausible, therefore, is that between the Christians and the corresponding spiritual province among the pagans, that is, the masses of the ancient world. So, Christianity through the centuries, he's explaining the same kind of thing, just in different terms. Like, so we see these wars going on between the church and state, the refusal of most modern dictatorial rulers to permit their people to have any private interests separate from their public life in the state is more easily understood if one remembers that the Roman emperors did not think that one could have a private religion without endangering the existence of the state. The relationship between the church and state has again become a real problem in Russia and its satellite states, and it is to be expected that the state will persecute Christians just as Decius and Diocletian did in their day. The danger inherent in the union of the church and state through the state supported for parochial schools and through the sending of envoys to the Vatican is illuminated by the slow decline of spirituality in the church and the interference with the church by the temporal power, beginning with the control of the Council of Nicaea by Constantine in 325. And it was already happening in Paul's day, because he says the philosophers of the Greeks thought that Christianity was foolishness because you're telling them to die and give up their worldly money, power, and position. So we see, like right here, it says, to note the origin of the Anglican Church in the struggle of the royal power with the papacy. The Anglican Church, when they were translating it under King James, was a battle with the papacy. Right here in God's Secretaries, the Making of the King James Bible, by Adam Nicholson, he tells you more about that battle. He explains to you that what he would not tolerate, King James, however, was any suggestion of his own royal authority being questioned. The same thing with Constantine, right? We can see how that would relate. The royal supremacy over church and state was the foundation of his position as King of England. So, and then over here, again, it says, precisely because the head of the church was also the head of state, King James, it was critical for their cause to separate theological questions from political. They had to establish themselves as politically loyal, even while asking for changes to the state religion in the form of the state church. Political correctness. And it was equally critical for the bishops to conflate them, to say, no, these Puritans down here don't need a place here. They're messing with the power. Throughout the summer, the bishops maintained that any questioning of the doctrine and articles of the Church of England was politically subversive, dangerous, and to be expunged. Anti-Puritan propaganda flooded the country. The Puritans were teetering along a narrow rock ledge, and they wrapped their suggestions in swaths of submissive cotton wool. So they had to be politically correct, or they'd cut off their heads or kill them. They addressed James. They said, neither as factious men affecting a popular party in the church, no hint of getting rid of the bishops. So they wanted to get rid of the bishops, is what he's saying. Nor as schismatics aiming at the dissolution of the state ecclesiastical. They wanted to distinguish themselves from the true extremists who took from the New Testament that each congregation should be independent and free of all worldly authority, which is what Jesus said in Mark chapter 10, verses 42 through 45. We're not going to have a structure like the Gentiles. Bishops and deacons and ministry and all that have been perverted by these guys, especially since we saw over here in like Light from the Ancient East, and we see from the New Testament, it was poor people. It was poor people. It has nothing to do with what we see going on in the world today. And we can see that same Jewish and Grecian popular vote kind of thing, where all these eloquent speakers and the most likable personality, we've seen it throughout here. That's what they're talking about, because it's talking about worldly powers, just like with the Constantine thing and the King James thing. Like, those are worldly powers. Those aren't people standing up for Jesus. Those are people who are making money, educated men like the rabbis and the Grecian philosophers. It's all about the money, right? So over here in Harvest of Hellenism, he explains where this concept of church comes from, because he says, it is not difficult to understand the appeal of Isis. Constantly before the eye of the believer, she was the protected and celebrated object of a highly organized cult apparatus that had all the appearances of a church. Church is the word Circe. Of course it does. That's what Clement said over there in that Philip Schaff dictionary, is that they fly out. They're like Circe, because she transforms them to beast and swine, and that's what we see in all these buildings that call themselves churches. No resemblance whatsoever of the followers of Jesus Christ. So it says here, Paul and John were mere naive pioneers in a field of infinite complexity. They had